As she stood behind him at his feet, wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. I'll confess. Some of you may have noticed, I hope not, but you may have. I can get focused. I really can. And if I'm focused and I'm going through a store looking for something, I can be so focused, I don't see anybody around me. And on occasion, I've walked right by people that I know quite well. Or I've stood next to them in line. And until they spoke up, I didn't realize who I was walking by or who I was standing next to. Now, it wasn't intentional. I don't intentionally ignore people. So if you've been the recipient of that, I'm confessing to you ahead of time. I have done that before, and I'll probably do it again. It's not something I'm tickled about, but I've done it. Have you ever done that? Just not noticed what was going on around you, just not seen somebody right beside you or close by that you know, driven past somebody and you didn't even realize you'd driven by them. I think it's something that is not unusual, not uncommon. And of and in and by itself, I don't suppose it's really a big problem unless you carry that into other areas of life. Like in your awareness of God and Him at work in your world. And there's a lot of us that don't even notice blessings that come our way. Don't even notice God when He's trying to speak to us. It's one of my favorite stories. Did you hear the one about the man that was praying early in the morning? He said, Lord, I haven't witnessed, but I know I'm supposed to. So give me someone to witness to. Give me somebody to tell about you. And that was his prayer that morning. Rode a bus into town to go to work. Got on the bus. There were 2 seats empty. He sat down in one of them. Next stop, a man got on the bus and sat next to him. They hadn't much more than started, and the guy started crying, just sobbing. And he was saying, oh, I need to know God. Is there anybody that could tell me about God? Oh, I need to know that. The man who'd prayed that morning looked up and he said, Lord, is this a sign? When we bring our preoccupation to bear in our lives and miss God, that's a tragedy. If you hadn't realized it, it's a tragedy. We're going to read a story about that, or look at this story and see that. And what we're going to do is we're going to see 2 people. But before we do that, let me share with you a poem that has become one of my favorites. It's not very long. It's by the poetess by the name of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert Browning's wife, who was a poetess in her own right. It's 4 lines. This is what it says. Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. We've got 2 people in our story. I want us to mostly focus on the woman in the story. And when we do, we'll see that she reveals a recognition of some things. She's not the only one there, but she reveals a recognition. First thing she recognizes who Jesus is, who He is. In this story, contrast is naturally built into it. We have 2 main characters aside from Jesus that are in the story. One of them, we're told his name. His name is Simon. He's a Pharisee. If you don't know anything about Pharisees, please understand they were the super saints of Jewish faith and practice. They worked all day long to memorize all the laws that a godly person should know. And they tried in everything they had to follow every one of those minutiae laws. When it came to tithing, something many of us don't worry about, but when it came to tithing, they would even tithe the seeds, the seeds out of their garden that were used for spices. They were that meticulous. Simon was a Pharisee. And Simon had invited Jesus to come eat with him, and as is the common thing, they often ate outside on a patio, so others around town could come and stand around and listen and see what was going on. Deeply educated, deeply religious, deeply confident, Simon was, in his own right relationship with God. He knew he stood out above just about everybody else. He knew he focused on doing what God wanted. But Jesus was right there at his table. And he didn't see him. And he didn't recognize him. And he didn't know who he was. Because Simon's focus was so inward into all the rules and the regulations. He was so inward into him and how right he was with God. He was so sure he knew God and all that God wanted, that even though he had the very Son of God right at his table, can you just imagine the awe that should have been there? Didn't recognize him. Didn't recognize him. Now, the opposite was the woman that was there. She's not named. Do you notice that? We're not supposed to give her praise. We're just supposed to learn from her. There was a woman there. She wasn't invited to sit at the table. Simon wouldn't have invited her to sit at the table. As a matter of fact, he condemned Jesus for allowing the woman to touch him. He said if Jesus really was a prophet, he'd know the sinful nature of the person touching him. She was a person that was well known throughout the city. Bygone days, we'd have called her a fallen woman. She was someone whose lifestyle and morality did not make her acceptable in nice company. It was open, it was blatant, it was well known. Wasn't very well educated. In all probability, her immorality is how she survived. But that's who was there. That's who was just around the edge, listening and watching Jesus. Now, the Bible says she came there, so probably she'd stood at the back of the crowd before, because no godly person, nobody like Simon would have gotten anywhere near her. But probably stood at the back of the crowd before and heard Jesus speak, because she came there. And she was there while he was reclining at the table. And she did what, as far as we know, nobody else at that table did. She looked. She listened. And she recognized Jesus. Now, why? Why on both accounts? Why Simon the way he was? Why this woman the way she was? There's another story in the Bible, and I'll just highlight it for you. There's another story where Jesus took his apostles and he took them up to Caesarea Philippi. Those who went with me to Israel saw Caesarea Philippi up in the northern region. It was the capital of Philip, one of the sons of Herod the Great, and it's where he formed his capital. Jesus took his disciples up there, and while they were up there, he looked at them and he said, "Who do you say that I am?" You know, that's the most central, the most key question in all of the Bible, and matter of fact, in all of life. Who do we say Jesus is? He said that to them. And Simon, not the Pharisee, the apostle, Simon said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." I want us to focus on Jesus' response. When Simon said that, he looked at Simon and he said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now, what's he saying? And when we catch that, we'll catch the answer to what's going on here. You can't get to God with your mind any more than with your actions. You can't figure out what God is saying, what he's doing. You can't hear him. You can't see him if all you implore and use is your mind. You can't. You have to see through God's eyes. You have to listen to God's Spirit. Simon Peter recognized Jesus because he heard God and saw through God who Jesus was. So there that day at that meal, as Jesus was reclining at the table of the Pharisee, we've got a contrast. We've got a man that had all the background to recognize God, was so preoccupied with what he had. He didn't see, he didn't listen, he didn't know. We've got a woman with absolutely no background, absolutely no qualifications. But she heard and she saw. And so what we see here is this woman recognizing who Jesus is. Which person would fit you and me today? Have we ever come to recognize who Jesus is? That's not the whole story. She had another recognition. When she recognized who Jesus is, she recognized what she was. What she was. Let's look at the two characters again. The Bible tells us in Genesis the very first sin that mankind committed was the sin of wanting to be like God. Simon and people like him want to be like God in that they want God to want what they want to give. They want God to be happy with what they are. And it blinds them. So there's Simon sitting there fully satisfied with himself. He had no reason to see himself in God's eyes. And in opposition to this is this unnamed woman. Wasn't invited, wasn't wanted. Simon would have sneered at her and run her away. But he was watching Jesus. There she was, and when she stood there before Jesus, and she saw who he was, it reflected back on herself. The Bible says she started crying. You know and I know, we've all seen tears. Sometimes it's a little teardrop. Sometimes it's 2 or 3. This woman let loose a flood. How can I tell you that? Because she used those tears to wash the dirty feet of Jesus. He'd been walking in the dusty roads and the dirt roads of Palestine all day. She cried enough that those tears fell and rinsed his feet clean. She got down on her hands and her knees. And she evidently had long hair, and she took her hair, she dried his feet, and then she put that perfume she'd brought on his feet. And she kissed his feet over and over and over again. Why'd she do that? Jesus said, Simon, I'm your guest. You didn't give me water to wash my feet, a rag to dry them. You didn't give me oil to anoint my head. And this woman has not stopped washing my feet with her tears, drying my feet with her hair, and kissing my feet as well as anointing my feet. The difference is, when this woman realized who Jesus was, she caught a reflection of how far from God she really was. She saw sin for what it was. The Bible is full of illustrations of that. Do you remember the story of Isaiah in the temple in the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah the prophet? And all of a sudden he finds himself high and lifted up in the throne room of God, standing before the throne of God, and he cries out, "Oh, woe is me, for I'm undone, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." Do you remember the story of Simon Peter, the apostle, in the fishing boat, who pulls up the net, sees all those fish, and all of a sudden his eyes recognize what Jesus must be, and he falls in the bottom of that smelly little boat, and he cries out, "Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." Do you remember Paul the apostle? The 7th chapter of Romans, writing, and all of a sudden it overwhelms him, and he says, "Oh, wretched man that I am, because I do that which I would not do." What we're seeing here is, when our eyes are open, when we allow God to show us Jesus for who and what he is, then we can see clearly all the things we excuse in ourselves, all the sins, all the arrogance, all the pride, all the different issues, and see what it really is. And in the case of this woman, it broke her heart. People had called her a sinner, but she saw what that meant and recognized herself fitting in that. So here we've got recognition again on the part of the woman. She recognized who Jesus is. She recognized what she was, but she didn't stop there. Over my years of ministry, I found a lot of people who repent. "Oh, I'm so sorry." And they stop right there. Yeah, she repented. That's what her tears meant. But she didn't stop there. She also recognized what she lacked. When the Pharisees failed to recognize who Jesus was, and consequently didn't see what he was and who he was, he had no sense of needing anything. He was complete. He was full. He could take pride in himself, knew that God would take pride in himself. So why did he have Jesus there? Well, because he'd heard about him, and he wanted to probe him and question him. And Simon wanted to pit his intelligence against Jesus so that he could do what nobody else had done. He could show that Jesus was in error because he was tearing up the religious community with his insights and his teachings. And Simon was going to catch him in it, in a quiet, relaxed setting around the table. For the woman, she just made one more small step. Having her eyes open to who Jesus is, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. She saw herself for what she was and saw what she lacked, how far from God she really was. And that left only one small step. She who had rejected conventional morality, she who had walked her own way, ignoring the reaction of others, gave her heart and her life to Jesus. Now, Carl, how do you know that? Well, I didn't read it to you, but it's there. In the 50th verse of that same chapter of Luke, Jesus looks at the woman, he said, "Go in peace, your faith has made you whole." You're saved. You're saved. In that recognition on the part of the woman needs to come our recognition. We need to look, we need to see, every one of us, Jesus all around us, who and what he is, reflected back from him, who and what we really are, not what we pretend to be, not what we think we are, but who we are. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And recognize that in those two things, there's a need we each and every one has. Elizabeth Barrett Browning said this: But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries. Are you plucking blackberries? Have you already kicked your shoes off? One woman took her shoes off and dwells forever with God. Boys and girls, men and women, where are you in your relationship with Jesus? Is he in your heart? Are you open to seeing him each and every day and letting him reflect in you? Or are you complacent, self-satisfied, and blind? Weeping, she began to